Hello, you are listening to the One Idjit's Thoughts on podcast. I am Paul Mackey, one Idjit in a sea of millions. I generally have a goal of 2 episodes out a week, and I'm mostly behind, but it looks good for that to happen this week. In fact, I might be recording both episodes in question on back-to-back days, or even all today. Or not, you know how life can be. Meanwhile, I've been doing lots of graphics elements setup and other writing for Seeing Things, Press Gang, and that other show that's premiering March 3rd. So, let's get into Whiz Kids Episode 10, The Network, aired January 7th, 1984. Now, before I get too far into the episode, I'll point out that this episode aired on Saturday, January 7th. It marks a shift in the show in several ways. Bob Shane was no longer showrunner, replaced by James Crocker. While there have been security threats and possible criminal consequences featured in past episodes, this really marks a noticeable tonal shift from even the Red Star Rising episode last time. With the Saturday reschedule, they're now up against Different Strokes and Silver Spoons at NBC, a difficult match if you skew toward a kid's audience, and TJ Hooker at ABC. Is it possible that Whiz Kids has been confronted with an identity crisis? That day of note, on January 7th, following the country's achievement of full independence on January 1st, the Sultanate of Brunei joined the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The top 5 movies at the U.S. box office were number 5, Uncommon Valor, number 4, Yentl, number 3, Scarface, number 2, Sudden Impact, and Terms of Endearment remained at number 1. Looking at some of the charts in Billboard magazine, the video games list are number 5, Popeye, number 4, Mr. Do, number 3, Pole Position, number 2, Ms. Pac-Man, and number 1, Q*bert for the 17th week. UK records, according to Music and Video Week, reported in Billboard, were number 5, Margarita Time by Status Quo, number 4, Love of the Common People by Paul Young, number 3, Victims by Culture Club, number 2, My Oh My by Slade, and number 1 was Only You by the Flying Pickets, still hanging on after scoring their Christmas number 1 the previous week. The U.S. Hot 100 was topped by number 5, Twist of Fate by Olivia Newton-John, number 4, Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes, number 3, Union of the Snake by Duran Duran, number 2, Say It Isn't So by Hall & Oates, and number 1 once again is Say 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 by Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson. So a brief summary. The episode opens with the operations of the school's BBS system, users signing on, getting credentials, and then a new user, Wrench, offers up a general post of a phone number and a password. The next morning, a girl shows Richie the message, and he says Wrench is a legendary hacker. Then he tries the number, and the password works, but it gets kicked out as soon as he tries to go further. Ham is getting ready to perform drumming in a band for a school dance and is also looking forward to buying his brother's car if he can get the rest of the gang to chip in a little. At home, Richie keeps dialing in and trying to gain further access at Wrench's mystery number. The next morning in Washington, a couple of staffers are talking about penetrations into the military network all over the country, with many gaining low-level access. They are preparing to inform the president. Richie informs the gang he has figured out how to communicate with the mystery number without getting kicked out. It works, and Alice tries it out first. She types menu and reveals that they are in the National Security Agency's classified data exchange. The show makes it clear they do not know what they're getting into, but Richie is ready to explore. Outside the house, agents converge, cut the power, and move in. It's the FBI. They arrest the kids and confiscate all the computer gear. At court, Irene tries to get a long-distance call through when Farley arrives. Then the lawyer comes out and says that since the penetration of the NSA showed the skill of adults, they will be arraigned in Superior Court as adults. Ham is told he cannot participate in the performance due to the criminal arraignment by school rules. The kids are being told not to associate with each other until the trial is over. Irene gets hold of Richie's dad and asks him to pull some strings in Washington. Alice tells Richie she won't blame it all on him like the lawyer wants, but Richie says she should. Farley tries to get Quinn's help, saying the kids were exploring and didn't know what they were getting into. A man named Garrett Kelly introduces himself to Richie at school. He says he's from the NSA and says Richie could help them, and in turn Kelly could help get the kids out of their jam. Richie agrees to meet at the school, and they drive away to a remote warehouse guarded by Marines. Inside, Kelly shows off a massive computer equipment setup, including Ralph. Kelly reveals he is Wrench, and the info was released as a sort of hacker test contest to find the best of the country. Ham, Jeremy, and Alice meet up. Ham showing off his car. They go to find Richie. They've decided to get all their parents and the kids together in a room without lawyers to try to get tried as a group, instead of Richie ultimately going down alone. Richie says maybe next week, but he pushes them away. Quinn meets with an FBI contact. He says they're in a civilian payroll computer, but nowhere near anything sensitive, but the NSA is still out for blood. Quinn reports it back to Farley, who presses the Wrench angle, saying Wrench was ultimately the responsible one for all the penetrations around the country. Kelly picks up Richie at a street corner at night, and the rest of the gang follow in Ham's car. Quinn and Farley find one criminal in the database with the nickname Wrench, but he's deceased. After Richie and Kelly go inside the warehouse, Ham goes to investigate Kelly's car. The Marines come out, but they're speaking Russian. One of them chides the other to maintain their cover, and they switch to English, and discuss whether Richie will be killed or brought back to Russia, all without knowing Ham was hiding in the car behind them. Irene greets Richie's dad, Don Adler, at the house, and he introduces a friend of his from the NSA. Ham tells the other kids the phony Marines were Russians. Kelly tells Richie they are 5 minutes away from working. Bob, the NSA man, tells Irene they know Richie has been conversant with a Russian spy and the FBI is working on it. Ham calls Quinn and tells him the address where Richie is, but the phones go dead. The national communications networks go down. TV, phones, everything. Whatever Richie is doing, on the screens it looks like nuclear war simulations, scenario after scenario. Farley and Quinn meet up with Richie's parents and Bob, the NSA guy, and they all realize whatever was planned is happening. The police raid the warehouse along with Don Adler and Bob from the NSA. Bob explains the Russians were using Richie to record nuclear response scenarios using a narrow window where they took down the national network and set up their own. At the close of the episode, Don consoles Richie. It's okay that he got fooled. It's not his fault. Richie thought he was being patriotic. He's a good kid, and he always does his best. My favorite line...
It may be cold machines to some people, Quinn, but to a 16-year-old with a flair for it, it's a mathematical puzzle. It's a pure challenge, maybe irresistible. And that might be all that keeps the whole thing from getting out of balance.
My favorite lines are usually something funny, but this episode doesn't really have much comic relief. This seems like a good summary of what mindset many teen hackers of the day had. The Who Is query. Jeremy's dad is played by Merle Saunders in what appears to be his only credited acting role. He is much better known as a musician. Merle Saunders was born in San Mateo, California in 1934. He formed his first band in high school featuring Johnny Mathis on vocals. In the early 1970s, he formed Saunders Garcia, partnered with Jerry Garcia, who he met playing at the Fillmore in San Francisco. That band lasted 4 years and 3 albums, but he continued to work in other projects with Garcia, including sitting in with the Grateful Dead. He worked with retraining Jerry Garcia on guitar following the diabetic coma Garcia suffered in 1986. Over the years, he worked with diverse artists like Miles Davis, B.B. King, Sheila E., Bonnie Raitt, and Widespread Panic. He also worked in composing and performing for television. I'm certain an association with Simon & Simon scored him the on-screen appearance in Whiz Kids. As a composer, he worked with the Grateful Dead on the theme music for the Twilight Zone revival on CBS in 1985, and he also worked music department for individual episodes. He worked with the PBS miniseries of the Vietnam War on television in 1983 and returned to work for American Experience in the late 1990s. Merle Saunders suffered a stroke in 2002, which caused his retirement from work in music, and he passed away in 2008 from complications related to the stroke. That Week in Tech is taking the week off. I didn't really spot anything interesting this week. We already had covered the Heathkit robot, and otherwise the computers were all pretty anonymous looking. I suppose it's possible that computer companies loaning their consultation and tech didn't want their computer to be shown to be the one that is hacking the NSA. Totally 80s. This is unquestionably a Cold War story, and a War Games-inspired computer-era story, and those only intersected in the 1980s. I felt the Cold War tensions like I remember from the mid-80s, more so in this episode than last week, probably since there were no animated toys, and the resolution of the episode didn't involve insertion of any produce in any tailpipes. Artifactoids. I'm not really a car guy, but Google Lens showed me some cars in comparison with a screen grab, and I'm pretty sure in this episode, Ham became a proud owner of a 1964 Ford Falcon. In general, the Ford Falcon is regarded as the first compact sedan produced by the big three American car manufacturers. The first generation was released in 1960 under the leadership of Robert McNamara, before he left the position to become Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration. Charles Schultz's Peanuts were mascots in both print and television advertising. The 1964 Falcon was part of the second generation of Falcons, and TV's Hazel character, played by Shirley Booth, was added into the advertising mix alongside those Peanuts characters. The 1964 Falcon had a 3-speed manual transmission, and in 1965 a 3-speed automatic transmission was available. It was usually offered with an inline 6-cylinder engine with optional V8. 1970 was the final year of the third generation of Falcons. The model line was replaced with the Ford Maverick. What worked? Personally, I don't mind the tonal shift too much. The War Games-esque last act had some good old Cold War tension of the kind I haven't seen recreated anywhere that has tried to do so since. I didn't really like that one hand of the federal government didn't know what the other was doing, but that seemed pretty realistic, so I'll let that go. What didn't work? I think they skimped a bit on the last act. There wasn't much on screen about what they told Richie they were doing. I'm also fuzzy on how the Soviet spy got his hands on Ralph if the real NSA and FBI were the ones who confiscated the equipment. Did absolutely nobody from the Feds say, "Hey, isn't this that gang of kids who took down the Russian spies last week?" Also, I'm really starting to like the gang of kids, and while the rest were instrumental in saving Richie, this definitely felt more like a Richie episode with the rest somewhat sidelined. I'm curious if Ham's car will be part of subsequent episodes or not. The big red reset button on the end of older TV episodes could be in effect, and also episode order was mixed up by networks more often back then. Well, when I'm making this show, I'm trying to do my own research as much as possible when I make all the episodes of this and all the other shows. But that said, I once again want to thank Chris Cooling and his Forgotten TV podcast, which helped me get that detail on the name of the showrunner changed from this episode forward. So next time is Whiz Kids episode 11, Watch Out! Happy hunting! You've been listening to the One Idjit's Thoughts On podcast, produced by Paul Mackey in association with Nimlas Studios. Any short clips of audio from shows is included under fair use for commentary purposes, and copyright for that content remains with its original copyright holders. The theme song is Too Good by Jack Mangan and is used by his generous permission. One Idjit's Thoughts is produced under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. You can find more episodes of this podcast and many other fine podcasts at nimlas.org. You can contact me by emailing idjitcastpodcast@gmail.com or commenting on episodes at nimlas.org.
Let's make our own memories.
What'd you find out?
Who has a 7-ounce New York strip steak dinner for $2.99 or 14-ounce steak dinner for $5.99? Kelly's Restaurant at the intersection of M115 and the Marion Road.
Well, that's enough, isn't it?
Guess I gotta get to Michigan and invent time travel, I suppose.